Good afternoon. I was just wanting to go over a research paper I recently wrote on the topic of Asperger syndrome, which, for all of you who are not aware with what that is, Asperger syndrome is a mild, high functioning form of autism. And it's marked in several ways and traits. And the two most prominent, at least according to the DSM 5 diagnosing manual, which states basically social skill issues, and basically repetitive, obsessive fixation in topics of personal interest. And I find that fascinating because I don't really like to see it as just a diagnosis or a label. I don't like labels. I like to think of things more like adjectives that describe a personality of a person, their unique wiring. And so I don't like just going around giving people labels. You know, I use a wheelchair to get around. But I don't consider myself a disabled person. I consider myself a person that uses a wheelchair to enable him to get around more easily. That's the difference, and I think a lot of these things we oftentimes accept as labels over ourselves are just adjectives that kind of describe how we are as people. At the end of the day, people are people, and you got to treat them with respect and decency just like everybody else. You got to interact with them just like normal people. And sometimes I think we get into the thinking where we address people. For instance, you know, a lot of people, when they see a handicapped person, they think they have to talk to them a certain way, but just talk to people like normal people. Just treat them with the same level of professionalism or respect as you would anybody else. And so I just wanted to do this little paper to kind of like talk a little bit on the topic. A lot of my videos on YouTube have to do with my faith and preaching of the Word of God, which I love doing that too. That's one of my particular favorite types of topics to go over. But I also do think it's very, very nice to kind of switch things up just a little bit and go over something that I'm personally familiar with as an individual. Just kind of give myself a little bit of personality here beyond just what I do as a regular thing, and talk about how I was diagnosed with that form of autism as a very young child. And I don't think it has impaired my ability to function any more than my use of a wheelchair has impaired my ability to function as an individual. I mean, it's all how you really look at a particular situation. You can think of it as something that slows you down and keeps you from the best life that God wants to give you, that He's created you for, or you can see it as an opportunity to just be who you were made to be and use your unique skills and abilities in a way that best glorifies Him and betters the lives of people around you. Now, so some of the most common traits I have discovered and I have read about in someone's diagnosis with Asperger's is poor social skills is oftentimes a characteristic. Yeah, and I speak from my own experience because my social skills used to be quite awkward and not the best. The difficulty in establishing normal, healthy relationships with peers is one common trait, and one-sided conversations that may be perceived as genuine disinterest, kind of even rude, or always seem to go back to a particular topic that person wants to talk about. And that is a common trait in Asperger syndromes, is the person who has it oftentimes changes the conversation to redirect it back to what they want to talk about. And that's because of that obsessive thinking. Obsessive thinking is often a trait characterized in Asperger's. It's often, you know, you could mistake it easily as OCD, which, yes, there is an element of OCD in having an Asperger diagnosis. However, when you get diagnosed specifically with Asperger's, apparently, according to the most recent psychiatric diagnosing manual, you cannot have a separate ADHD or OCD diagnosis along with that. You have to classify it in its own separate category as ASD. And so, which goes back to the whole obsessing on the particular topic of interest. Oftentimes, the mind of somebody with an ASD diagnosis will keep going back to that thing they're really interested in and want to talk about. And so, I don't think this is necessarily an issue as long as we learn to adapt and keep it under control. Be who you are, yet at the same time learn to make little reasonable adjustments that make the people around you feel more comfortable and more invited, and feel like they actually have a place to say what they want to talk about too. I mean, it's just a matter of respect, I think. It's just a matter of a two-way relationship where you're discussing with somebody and you're letting them share with what's on their mind and life too. So the person who has Asperger's is often most tempted, I think, to desire to talk about the things they want to talk about. Someone with Asperger's diagnosis may not be good at reading non-verbal body language or sarcasm or certain facets of social etiquette, and that's the big drawback to having an Asperger diagnosis. Sometimes they don't have the natural ability just to pick up on things like sarcasm or, for example, just social cues that most people seem to understand by the get-go. Which, okay, yeah, we know it's a disadvantage, but there's totally things that can be worked through. Lack of eye contact is another big one. And as you see, when I'm looking at the camera, I am making pretty good eye contact, but it's taken years to really develop that ability to, keep good eye contact. It's very important. When you're going to a job interview, for example, if you make really good eye contact, you're really confident, you present yourself well, you're more likely to probably get the job, as long as your skills and qualifications match. So I think eye contact is something we can practice on regularly, and it almost becomes second nature. And so sometimes repetitive physical movements, such as rocking back and forth, and we've all seen some individuals sometimes that will rock back and forth, do repetitive, like for example, some people will do this on a regular basis. And that's I don't know how to describe that. I used to do that myself. It's very calming. It just feels relaxing for some reason. I don't know. Maybe one of just those funny things that, it just feels good. And so the repeated habitual habits and routines are a common experience shared with those who have an ASD diagnosis. Change is obviously, in many cases, unwelcome, not enjoyable, for most people, but especially for someone with ASD. They have a much harder time adapting to changes they don't want to make in their environment. And I knew this gentleman at a job one time. He got his desk moved several times and caused him great anxiety. He had Asperger's, but he did not like his desk being moved. He wanted to keep it right in the same place it was. And whenever they moved it, he kind of had a little bit of a anxiety attack, which is understandable. He liked his normal routine. That is a very big common thing in the ASD. And I will say personally, first from my own experience, there are some routine disruptions I do not like. For example, if I wake up in the morning, my routine is I like to spend time just alone with myself, with some exceptions. Yes, I love talking to my girlfriend in the morning, and I love doing that, but it's pretty much, I like my alone time in the morning. There's very few people I want to interact with, very few things I actually want to go and do, so that's one reason I don't like working mornings. Because I need that time to collect myself and compose myself and get ready and prepared for whatever social activity I have to do eventually after that. That's one routine I don't like disrupted. For example, I use myself as a personal example because I know how it feels to be in that kind of mode of thinking. And so the preferred routine, I'll call it the preferred routine, because there's always routines or things that we would gladly change if we could. However, I say personal preferred routine to specify the specific routines that people with ASD do not like disrupted. There's certain little characteristics, and like, for example, when I get off work, I want to go straight home. I don't like having to stop and get gas afterwards or stop or get anything else, and so I try to get everything taken care of before I go to the job so I don't have to stop right after I get off work. That's just one of my things. I don't like disruption when I'm trying to go straight home, for example. So I specifically refer to changes that an ASD individual does not like or does not welcome. So I will try to make my best effort to articulate why I or individuals with ASD do not like routine change. And one of those is in a later section. But it's true that the level of anxiety, irritability, or frustration may be heightened in someone who has an ASD diagnosis. It's just because the way their brain is wired. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a unique brain wiring, the way a person thinks. And we all have our unique brain wirings. We all as human beings do not like unwanted change. Of course, that's a given. That's part of being a human. However, ASD seems to create a greater emotional agitation when it relates to a person with Asperger syndrome that has to go through a change they don't want to make. Another trait that seems to characterize high-functioning autism is abnormal facial expressions or lack of them, as well as often lack of voice inflection. Sometimes people with ASD will speak really monotone, or they'll get really energetic and start animated. You know, you could get kind of a mix between both. If you encounter somebody with ASD, sometimes they're either really energetic or really monotone. So, understand that sometimes there's just those unique little symptomatic things that can kind of help you understand, yeah, I'm dealing with somebody who has an Asperger diagnosis. It's just kind of how they are. You know, we accept it. It's okay. But these are the things I look for and that stand out to me. You know, they're just little unique little traits. It doesn't mean anything bad. It's just we all have a unique, different way of interacting with people. I mean, we have a unique things that make us uniquely us, okay? And so it's just a matter of being a different person, let's just say that. We don't have to feel like it's something that's bad or anything like that. You just got to understand, yeah, I'm a different person. There's differences about me. Not everybody's going to understand it fully well, but, oh well. Another trait that seems to characterize high-functioning autism and ASD is, yes, abnormal facial expressions. Sometimes somebody with ASD will really get all sorts of weird facial expressions, especially if they're shocked by something you say or they feel uncomfortable. You can kind of see it more in their face than you would sometimes a normal individual. And then when I say normal, I mean the stereotyped human response to certain things. There is a way that a lot of people respond to things, or even most, that somebody with ASD might do differently, and that's okay. According to an article titled, "What is Asperger Syndrome?" In signs and symptoms section, one trait is speech sound unusual, such as flat, high-pitched, quiet, loud, or robotic. That is at www.nationwidechildren.org/conditions/Asperger-syndrome. So, that's just a little brief overview. So we'll go on to the next page, and Asperger syndrome affects every individual differently, and according to the same article, one of the most common traits that overlaps most, if not all, who have a diagnosis with it is an intense obsession with one or two specific narrow subjects. Now, of course, there's always anomalies. There's always people with it that like may have interest in like a varying number of topics. But oftentimes it's one or two really huge topics of interest. But it can vary from person to person. Sometimes somebody who has it might get interested in a whole list of things and becomes very knowledgeable on a lot of things. So, you can't just always make every trait an absolute as it affects everybody the same way. It does not often. Strengths. Let's go over the strengths of having it. Okay, suppose we could lead into the section with how it could be a strength, okay? For starters, people with Asperger syndrome can become very advanced in their knowledge on matters of interest. That's a good thing. Due to being obsessed with it, they focus on these topics so intensely, quote, I'm quoting this, they become experts in these areas. This characteristic of Asperger syndrome has given rise to the mistaken popular notion that all individuals with the syndrome are savants. Quote, end of quote. According to the article titled Asperger Syndrome found on www.spectrumnews.org, wiki/Asperger syndrome / okay. So the weaknesses, let's go into the weaknesses, because I think every personality type with its strengths has its own weaknesses, and we'll go over that here in a second. One of the greatest weaknesses I feel most commonly shared by people with Asperger's or ASD, more commonly, or whatever you want to call it, whether abbreviation or the actual name, is difficulty with social interaction. That's a big one. So many are perceived to be socially awkward, uninterested, or even rude at times. I have both my own life stories about myself as well as friends who have let me know they have it too. One observation, I would say, when dealing with a person with ASD, they may often, frequently, and regularly display tendencies to change the subject matter in a conversation to return back to their interest or what they want to talk about or themselves. Though it's truly difficult tendency to overcome, I feel it can be improved upon, definitely. It takes determination and practice and effort, however. Many high-functioning autistic people, however, like I said before, are resistant to change, and I think that's one of the huge reasons some of these changes are hard to make is because change also requires some level of behavioral adjustment, and so many individuals with ASD have expressed things along the lines, I should not have to change my personality to be loved and accepted. True, that's correct, yet we should embrace the unique way God has made us and our personality. I do, however, feel this is erroneous notion to suggest behavior modification is the equivalent of personality change, because we always got our underlying personality. However, we will adjust as human beings all the time based on a situation to fit what kind of interaction we're having. We go to the job. Ideally, we should act like we're at the job professionally, in a way that reflects a work environment, for example. You go to the job, you don't act like you're at the Super Bowl party, or you don't act like you're just with a bunch of guy friends, do you? You act like you're at a work environment. And so we kind of have to adjust ourselves just a little bit depending on the situation. Many high-functioning autistic people have expressed that they feel like they are having to change their personalities just to fit in, which is, I feel, not the case. Personality really is who we are as individuals, yet there is nothing wrong with making some adjustments depending on the social setting that we're in. We gotta, 1, be considerate of others' feelings as well as their comfort level. 2, be selective with varying audiences of what we share and discuss. That's a big one. Thirdly, modifying speech, conversation, behavior as if it was a cover letter appropriate appropriately tailored to a particular or present audience. When we apply for jobs, for example, and when we write cover letters, we're familiar with this. We have to be specific and appropriate for the job we apply for. People with ASD have at times been known for oversharing. I got into trouble in my younger years for oversharing too much details on unnecessary information, not pertinent to or appropriate, for that matter, to what was being discussed or brought up. For example, you call into work feeling sick, you do not have to overshare you're experiencing all kinds of symptoms. You don't have to go through every symptom you're sharing, especially if it's kind of personal and nobody else wants to know that, okay? You could just call in and say, I'm not feeling well. I'm experiencing some symptoms. I won't go into details, but I am really under the weather right now, so if you could please excuse me. Something like that. For example, yes, you call into work feeling sick. You do not have to overshare your symptoms. Telling your boss that you have a bad case of diarrhea, for example, is generally probably something he or she does not want to know or need to know. Tools that can help a person with ASD include, well, for example, certain criteria that they go through to know if they are sharing too much. General principles. Who is the audience? Ask the who question. Is it a mixed male and female group of people, or is it all of the same gender? Okay? So sometimes when you're in a group of both men and women, you got to be very particular in what you share. Make sure it's audience appropriate, and it's not something that's going to make the opposite sex feel uncomfortable with when you're sharing it. Okay? Just general basic overview. In cases, for example, a group of mixture of men and women, well, you got to be careful with what you discuss. For one, ever been in a group and, well, it has been an awkward moment where a man or woman starts talking about personal issues that definitely do not feel comfortable hearing it, being heard about. Oh, let's see. And so, that's another thing to ask ourselves. Is it appropriate for the audience? And another one is it needful? Is it truly necessary? You probably don't want to hear your coworker talking about the colonoscopy they have scheduled that week. All your coworker says, well, needs to say to the boss, for example, I have a medical procedure where I'll be put under. I'm going under anesthesia here in a few days. Please excuse me from work this day. They don't need to say, I'm gonna get a colonoscopy here in a few days, and they're getting TMI, too much information. Most people don't want to know that. So too much detail and not necessary. The necessary part is what I want to focus on. Basically, anything or details that do not add value to the true practical relevance of saying something. Okay, like I stated, oh, pardon me, I had a, like I stated earlier in my example, calling in sick from some illness does not necessitate telling your boss the gnarly symptoms, or asking time off the job does not necessitate you go into great detail about a medical procedure that nobody really wants to know about that will require your absence. No one needs to know about, for example, you getting a colonoscopy. Nobody wants to know that. Or maybe you injured something and I don't know, and you're like, oh, well, I mean, if it's something, too much information is not always a good thing. So, context and situation. Let's move on to that one. The context, too, plays a role in what we share and not share. Great example, politics at the job. Here's the one that most everybody seems to get themselves into. Whether they have Asperger's or not, I feel it's not the most appropriate thing to talk about at work, regardless of your beliefs on the matter. You go to work, not really talk about politics, but, it seems like a common trend nowadays. But why people share political political beliefs at work, I'm not sure. Yet so often we find people oversharing opinions on this, opinions on that, and it creates issues and tension often. And we live in days where oversharing political beliefs with anyone and everyone is the thing to do. We can ask questions like, can I share this without too much sensitive details? What audience am I dealing with? Will adding extra details truly benefit and add value to what I am trying to convey? Or how can I best word what I need to or want to say without sharing too much personal or private sensitive information? Good key questions to ask. The point I'm trying to make here is we do not really need to forfeit or stifle personality necessarily just to be considerate and adaptive in a lot of situations. Poor stress processing and coping is another struggle that people with ASD have. So often under stress, the mind of someone with autism or ASD will find it extremely challenging to process that stress or articulate what they are feeling. For example, people with traditional forms of autism may engage in self-harming behaviors. According to the Jewel Autism Center, in an article they wrote, headbanging, in addition to self-injury and aggression, are very common autism symptoms. That's https://jewelautismcenter.com/jewel.blog-head-banging-in-autism/. There are thought to be a varying number of reasons for the urges to do such things, yet the common triggers can include a sensory processing overload. From my own experience, for example, with autism, there is some point where the stress levels and the frustrations build up enough, the mental stress feels overwhelming. And of course, living with high-functioning autism myself, I'm led to believe that at the times in the past, haven't done this in a very long time, but I engaged in this type of behavior or gotten so frustrated, I used to, as a teenager, for example, hit myself in the head when I got so frustrated. And that's a normal, common thing. I wouldn't say normal. I would say it's common trait. Somebody who's having let's just say, a meltdown of sorts to do that. And why, or the whole science behind it, is still not fully known, but it is a common tendency. It's likely that it comes from high anxiety, feeling trapped and overwhelmed with the situation. It was, in a way, a form of sensory overload. And there's two types of sensory overload, I feel. We oftentimes generalize sensory overload as just one, being external. Too much external stimuli, such as sight, sound, crowds, large, noisy environments, can all exasperate somebody with sensory processing disorder. But there is also, I think, the internal facet of a sensory process overload where you just get so overwhelmed with built-up anxiety. And it might not be caused by light, sound, lots of noise, or crowds. It may just be an internal pent-up frustration. Overload, through what I feel is a neglected topic entirely, certain long strains of anxiety built up through the day can eventually cause a meltdown as well. It can happen in everybody. I mean, it's just common to call it sensory overload when talking about autism, especially. Internal thoughts of frustration and anxiety are worth some level of observation. A small frustration or anxiety, as many may know, the mind of a person with Asperger's tends to be obviously get stuck and obsessing on certain things. Whether it's particular interest or something that's really stressing them out, causing them to worry or have anxiety. This has caused the mind of a person with this diagnosis tends to perseverate and fixate on certain things, good or bad. Therefore, as a result, it can be increasingly difficult for somebody with an ASD diagnosis to detach their mind from whatever they are fixated on. It's difficult overall for everyone in general not to get caught up in worrying. That's a problem for all of us. Yet one with Asperger's often has OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder traits, too, that go along with it. And so disciplining the mind and disengaging is not an easy thing to do. So I think one of the, which leads me to my final conclusion, how to most effectively utilize the unique gifting and wiring of the brain of one who has it. We have already established the ups and downs. We have concluded that, yes, ASD diagnoses have benefits and can make the mind of someone with it very intelligent and committed to being able to learn. Okay, that's a great thing. In many cases, ASD has a number of talents associated. However, often great strengths can also be our great corresponding weaknesses when we are not careful to balance things. For example, a courageous, honest person, straightforward people tend to err on sometimes being overly rude and harsh. Now, you got someone who's extremely caring, extremely sensitive, extremely gentle, and they want to, they don't want to hurt people's feelings. What is the downside to that kind of personality type? I'll tell you, sometimes people with that type of personality type let themselves get walked on too much. They're not assertive enough. They're too worried about hurting people's feelings, which is oftentimes a good thing, that they let themselves be walked on, or they don't say no or stand up when they need to. So, with every strength comes its own weaknesses, and so you got to be aware of your weaknesses as you're developing that strength, so that it's not going to keep you lopsided and interfere with your life. I have been of the opinion for many years I can use, as an individual, a lot of advice from people who don't have this same condition. From interacting with people who have not struggled with this, I have learned to kind of put my mind in their shoes and see how, when they say to me, Austin, you kind of said this back there, this is kind of how it came across. That's a very helpful tool. You get honest feedback. You get honest feedback from people. They are your real friends. They are your real friends. They really care about you. They really want you to improve and succeed. So it doesn't matter whether they have autism or not. That's one thing that really frustrates me about, a lot of people with high-functioning autism feel like segregating themselves. They feel like outcasts, and they just keep themselves by themselves and just say, I don't need to interact with the other people, blah, blah, blah. Well, there's a lot we can learn from people who think differently than us, have a kind of a different perspective on things. I think that's very important. And it's important just as much they hear from our perspective, too. That's a mutual exchange. That's kind of how life works. We got to mutually exchange. A husband, for example, and a wife, they have to listen to each other and learn from each other because they both have unique experiences and ways of thinking, And that's just part of life. And so the brain, I feel, is a very remarkable organ, and I feel we can learn to adapt more than we think we can. The concept of referring to neuroplasticity, which is basically the mind's ability to adapt to change and rewire itself to think in a different way. It's a remarkable organ that enables us to make adaptations. Sometimes those people who've had traumatic head injuries and the brain is able to relearn and rewire itself. It's really amazing. That's another topic for another day. I feel, though, that people with Asperger's have just as much of a shot as anyone else to live a healthy, normal, productive life. You don't have to change who you are. So often autistic people segregate themselves because they feel alien to the people around them and who do not have ASD diagnoses. I feel this approach is not healthy, and I feel it's always important to have a variety of differing people in our lives that can like help shape us as individuals. I think that's just an important part of life. I think it's just as important to have as many friends that have it as that don't have it as ones that do. I mean, I think it's good to vary things up. Also, another key is not taking things too personally. Easier said than done. Yet sometimes I feel like people feel like a total failures or rejects just because they encountered someone who may have said something critical or maybe even slightly negative. Maybe they've said something, well, this is something you did, it was kind of socially awkward, you shouldn't have done that, you know. That doesn't mean you're a reject or a social failure. It just means, oh, here is a weak spot that I have and I can improve on. Yet people will always say things that are negative or critical, even ones that don't like us, we can still learn something from. When a person with Asperger's has control, misworded that. What the person with Asperger's has control over, what we all have control over, is our own personal development. Using our personalities in a way that is self-aware, able to learn, and creatively yet expresses itself in a healthy, positive way. We got to be open to the ideas of needful change, as well as we got to also be willing to like say, you know, yeah, I have a unique personality. I embrace it for what it is, you know. So, hope you found this little video informative, and you have a wonderful day, everyone.